So we want to give you, again, another warm welcome to this weekend. Thank you for being here.
Let us pray. Eternal Lord, our God in heaven, please note that those of us here deem you worthy of worship. We salute you because you became one of us. We thank you for perfecting the human condition as you lived in perfect compliance with the divine will. We take great delight in how you mocked death by, of your own free will, laying down your life, and with that same will, you took it up again. It gives us hope, and we thank you for that hope. We now live in anticipation of your return. We ask one thing: give us the will to live your will, and then the grace to perform it. In your name we pray, amen.
All around campus, you see posters announcing the 110th anniversary of Pacific Union College on this campus. This morning, Katie Van Arsdale and I would like to spend a little time talking about what happened in 1909, what we know about what happened, showing you some pictures and artifacts. Now, Katie and I have this secret problem. We hope you'll overlook it. What is your problem?
Well, probably the biggest thing that's wrong with me is that I didn't go to PUC. I know. And I'm just hoping you'll forgive me and let me stay because, Eric.
I didn't go either. I went to some school back east, but I have now remedied that. I put on my tag here my name, and that says Alumnus 2017. And that's technically correct because they gave me an honorary degree in 2017, so I'm a graduate. All right, so we've taken care of that. Now, over the last 4 years, Katie, Katie became the archivist here in 2015. We have been carrying out an assignment that involves getting to know the PUC attic, I guess you could say. And we found a lot of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say it started as an attic, but we have great plans for making it an archive. And that's really the process we've been doing, opening all these boxes that are filled with jumbled papers or artifacts that we're not sure what we're going to find. Every layer we uncover, kind of like archaeology, suddenly you'll find a commencement program from 1915. Suddenly you'll find a photograph of Charles Irwin that you never saw before.
It's amazing to me the power of these documents and artifacts. There is something about preserving our history that is closely related to our success and our thriving. And you'll notice through the years, certain kinds of dictators and certain kinds of revolutionaries will say, it's important to destroy the past. It's important to tear down the statues. It's important to destroy the records. We've never had that at PUC, and I think we've also avoided the opposite extreme, which is to preserve exactly the way it was without using it in a new way. Both of those are are ways of misusing history, I suppose.
And I would pitch in that I think that wouldn't work at a school because we have to stay current and we have to continue to bring in new students and continue to teach. And trying to hold this place the way it was in 1909, as much fun as that would be for you and I, history buffs, we would really miss the electric lights.
Well, let's talk about 1909. 1909 is the year in which Pacific Union College reopens. We don't talk about it very much, but there was a year where Pacific Union College did not function. The old college at Healdsburg closed in 1908, and it wasn't until the fall of 1909 that they found a suitable property. Now, we have some pictures of the old years at Healdsburg. You can see the town square in Healdsburg there, and you can see the main college building. A few pictures of students, both the main college building for classrooms and then the dormitory.
Well, I'll pitch in. These are some pictures. I just wanted to let you know that a lot of the pictures you'll see today are pictures that I show during the holistic living class that I get invited to talk to students.
And
Our
that's really
incoming
what-
freshmen take this class.
Introducing them to our tradition.
Yeah, absolutely. The tradition of Adventist education, which in a nutshell is holistic living, to try and set them up for life skills, to cope with college, to kind of introduce them to the Adventist education tradition. Some students come from an Adventist background, so some don't, but to get them all on an equal footing. And then also to introduce them to this location, what's special about it, what can you gain from living here for 4 years, and what is our heritage. So there's a lot that gets covered, but that is holistic. So I show them these pictures, and Eric will give you some background, and I'll give you a little bit of the perspective I share with our students. A question I like to ask them, which you may ponder too, being PUC folk yourself, how interesting would it be if we were still in Healdsburg? Because this postcard of the town square, the building that you see at the top center was just 2 blocks away from the center of Healdsburg. So if you've ever visited that town, you know how built up it is now, filled with residential areas. In fact, the place where our school was is directly across the street from the Healdsburg Historical Society and Museum. So if you ever visit that location, stand on their front steps and look at the house across the street. And that's what was built where our building used to be. So you can really imagine how different the character of PUC would be if we were smack in the middle of a tourist town in our neighboring county of Sonoma. And students get really excited about the idea of being 2 blocks from restaurants, but then I ask them how noisy it would be and would you really be happier there? And they start to think about our location a little differently.
You notice Katie said where our building used to be. If you go to Healdsburg today, it's almost impossible to find some remnant of the college. Those 2 buildings you see are 1/3 of a mile apart. That was one of the problems. You had to walk from the dormitory to the main classroom building. And as Ellen White wrote in very striking language a few years later, while men slept, the devil sowed houses. The whole buildup of private property meant that it was difficult to carry out the kind of education they wanted to conduct, where they used gardening, where they used industrial shops, where they tried to educate the whole man or educate for eternity, as they said. Now, those buildings are all gone today. Anything at all there? I don't think so.
Ellen White's former house.
Right.
And there's some items from the school that they have at the Historical Society. They have a copy of one of the school catalogs that we don't have.
Oh.
And someday they're going to give me a scan of it. They share photos with us if we ask for free. They have some pictures of our students that we don't have. So people from Healdsburg College stayed in Healdsburg, and their history stayed there too. So there's a little bit of a story, I would say, more than anything else that stayed behind.
Just a memory.
A memory, yeah.
So what happens in 1909 is they find another property, a property they think is far more suitable for the kind of education they want to do. They've been looking for a while. They almost bought what is now the Buena Vista Winery, but it didn't turn out to have a clear title. And so they choose to buy Angwin's Resort. A Cornishman named Edwin Angwin had built a resort here in the beginning in the 1860s. People came up in the summer. What's here in 1860? I mean,
All right.
sorry, 1909.
Yeah. Let me skip forward a little, and we'll stay in Healdsburg for 1 second, just because I don't want to blast past something we were going to share with you.
Oh, yes.
So the kinds of students who are coming in 1909 are ones who had experienced PUC in Healdsburg, some of them. So in a way, they would be familiar with this kind of daily program. And as PUC people yourself, life was probably harder here then than it is now, right? So let's think even further back. How much harder was it in the very beginning? We have a copy of the daily program from the 3rd annual catalog in Healdsburg. The rising bell would sound at 5 a.m. So you can imagine, students then and students now all like to sleep. What a hard life. There was a 2-meal system. You could eat 2 meals a day that were served. Again, trying to do Adventist education, healthy living. But because every student did manual labor, because they're trying to train up the whole man, so to speak, if you were a very hungry young man of 19 who'd been cutting lumber all day, they would allow you to go to the kitchen to get a 3rd meal if you felt you needed it. They would offer you an onion sandwich.
An onion sandwich?
Yes. But the students were there because they cared and they wanted to be there. And this is typical of the pioneer spirit that they bring to Angwin, that they wanted to work, not only to pay their way through school, but to support the institution where they were at. And you get a little bit of that seriousness in this other snippet from a kind of a student handbook that says that silly fashions are unpopular here. No need to bring your Gibson girl hairstyle. We're going to be dressed appropriately. And in fact, the women of Healdsburg came up with their own contraption. You can see a picture at the bottom of a skirt that had a sort of levee system in it that you could pull a string and the whole thing would lift a few inches off the ground, because streets weren't paved back then and there weren't sidewalks, and you lived a 1/3 of a mile from the schoolrooms where you needed to study, so you'd have to tromp through the rainy season mud, and it was extremely unhealthful, so they invented a way around it. So these are the kind of people who suddenly find themselves without a home. Then they find Edwin Angwin's Resort, and here they move. So some final pictures of these students as they were. And in fact, they had named the school Pacific Union College in 1906 before they ever moved, because they knew the move was imminent, because the devil was sowing houses. And here's Edwin Angwin and his brothers. We are not sure exactly which one is Edwin. Eric, you have a theory?
Well, we have a picture of Edwin Angwin in old age. You'll see this in the exhibit over in the Rasmussen Art Gallery. See if you think he is the one who is sitting on the left or the one standing.
They look very similar, so
In
it's a
old
mystery.
age, he had less hair than he had in this picture.
But we'll have you cast votes, and then we'll all decide who he is. No.
Now, you'll also see in the exhibit, he is a citizen of Great Britain, and we have his naturalization papers. And the naturalization papers are written in very dramatic language, saying that he renounces and adjures and repeals, forever
repudiates.
gives up his loyalty to any foreign potentate, particularly Victoria, Queen of Britain and Ireland. It's all spelled out there. They made a big deal about it.
Which really puts you in mind of what era this is. It's a Victorian era, and he had built a Victorian resort for the rich and famous of Napa Valley and the Bay Area to come to. And if you do go see the exhibit in the art gallery, you can learn a little bit about some of the famous people we know came here. But this is the location that the Adventists bought. So you think about this pioneer spirit, this hardworking spirit, this desire to learn and to work, and it's moving this particular school to a Victorian resort.
A frivolous resort.
Surrounded
where they
by
have a
wine
dance
country.
hall, and they have tennis courts.
Oh, yes.
They have a croquet pitch.
Yep.
They have a swimming pool.
Bowling alley, dance hall.
And they have a herd of pigs, too.
Yep. And
Well, those are all things they need to deal with.
yeah. So they were a big party place, but also to come and recover from the city air. And that is something that we were able to keep for the PUC people. The natural setting that had drawn these rich folks still was a draw. And we include a quote here from Hannah Parchment, class of 1917. She wrote this letter to Walter Utt, the school historian. And Eric, what is it about this quote that calls to you?
Well, it hasn't changed that much, has it? The beauty of the long drive up the mountain range has lingered with me all these years, the mountain trail. I try to recapture that thrill whenever I'm driving through hills and forests, but never again the same, not that first time.
What else do we know about the first time?
This is another one. And what happened when we had the first edition of the college history in the 1950s? Walter out of the history department sent out a letter to former students saying, what do you remember about early PUC? This is one student's reaction. It's a very striking one. On that long ride up the hill, we seemed to leave the world behind. Somewhere on the way, we dropped useless and unnecessary conventions and artificial values until only the essentials, the real values of life, remained. We seem to understand the principles of Christian education more clearly here and have greater courage to put them into practice. Not a bad motto even for today. Well, there's the hotel. That stands on the site of Granger Hall. Mm-hmm. And in fact, the foundation of Granger Hall is the same as the foundation of that hotel. Mm-hmm. It's interesting to think, what would we have today if we had that hotel? Mm. Of course, it's easy to exaggerate the beauties of that hotel. You're just looking at a picture. Mm. It's a summer hotel. Mm-hmm. It's not insulated. There'd be a lot of problems with that hotel that have to be addressed. And then we have a number of other pictures, some of them taken the first day of school,
yeah.
Right?
From what I understand, the picture in the bottom that you can see the inside of a sitting room was one of a set of 27 pictures that were taken the day of the opening ceremonies. They took pictures of the hotel in this kind of pristine, almost alien sort of emptiness right before the students descend on it for the first time and after all the resort folks have left. And you can see this beautiful wallpaper, which Kelly Lynn asked a very smart question. I wonder how much of it was colored with arsenic green. We have no idea. So another reason we didn't keep the hotel, I'm sure. But you can see this beautiful place that's just waiting for something to be done with it. And just like the riot of pattern, and probably was very colorful, very beautiful, but like you said, not built for what this Adventist school needed to be home for. At that time, at the time of enrollment, about 42 students, and by the end of the year, they had more, and every year they would have more for a very long time.
Does it seem like a long time ago to you? 1909?
Oh. Sorry about that.
The first day, Ted Utt's father was here, and Ted's sitting over there. So it's not that long ago. Sure. There are some connections. Now, yep. Katie, what survived? What do we have from 1909 besides the foundation of Granger Hall?
Well, that's a tough question. From 1909, I think we have just kind of an echo on campus. We had somebody from the St. Helena Historical Society come to visit, and they said, I want to see things that are left from the resort. So we've had to ponder this question, because we took her to see the wall in front of Granger, and we said, well, and this road that runs through the middle of campus is the road we've had since the 1850s. So I guess that's old, but it sure doesn't look it. It's beautifully paved and lined with new cars, so kind of hard to get in that.
Students' cars.
Yeah. Well, new relative to 1909. And the bridge that you see here in the picture is now buried by the asphalt that covers Cuyahoga Pass. It's still there, but can you really see it? The basement of Granger, well, no one really needs to go down there. It's not very exciting. So what is left? Well, I think it's probably just the stories we tell.
Well, we have one artifact that goes back to Angwin's Resort, and that is sitting here on the platform.
So we have a rocking chair that we believe it was one of the ones that was on the porch. And it somehow survived. One rocking chair.
And I think we got this from Art Westfall.
Yes. Yes.
And we have a photograph that you can see in the exhibit that shows a chair like that. So that may be the closest thing we have to a direct link to those early days. I can't think of much of anything else except that gate, as you mentioned.
Yeah. I would say, if we're trying to remember what happened in 1909, since we can't see the buildings, and I'm not going to let you sit in this chair, then maybe the best we can do is we have some pictures and we have some memories that people have shared. And that's probably the closest we can come to recapturing what it was like, to try and just from people's memories and the pictures of the place that we have, cobble together the story of what happened and what mattered to those people then. I think that's the best route we have.
And some of the things that mattered to them still matter to us. The inspection committee, which included Ellen White, that came to see this place, were struck by 2 or 3 things. One was the forest, and they thought this was a tremendous resource that would last them indefinitely. Secondly, they were impressed by the water. They couldn't believe how much good water was available here. And those are both things that are still true. The rural location is still true, and it's still true that we can carry out a particular kind of education here more successfully than I think we could in other places. Well, let's look at some more pictures. Oh, yeah.
Something else that matters to us, Ellen White.
This is the first day of school. It's September of
September 29.
September 29. That is the repurposed dance hall you're looking at there. It now has a platform, it has an American flag, and school desks in there. And the statements that are made on that day are very revealing, including the statements about God chose this place for us, and look at the resources that we have.
Yeah. Let's see here. Yeah. So this is our first year of students and faculty. Those who were there in June of 1910 and happened to have time for a photograph at least.
And that building is?
The steps of the hotel.
Of the old hotel, yeah.
Yep. There was a very family atmosphere. For years, the whole school would gather together for these group photos. And for as long as the hotel was there, they used the hotel, I think, for just the first few years, because once they built Irwin Hall, they took their family portraits in front of Irwin Hall ever after that.
The hotel in the first year had the one place that was warm on campus. They had a stove in the parlor. Okay, some very interesting pictures here. One of them is out of place. Can you tell which picture doesn't belong in our discussion of the early days? The baseball game. That is President W.I. Smith, president in the 30s. And by the 1930s, it was okay to play baseball. He's probably playing it out on the picnic grounds off Las Posadas Road. And they say that in the earliest days, if you had a bat and ball and started to play a game, out of nowhere, President Irwin would appear and confiscate them. But not anymore by the time we get to the 30s. What's going on in these other pictures?
Yeah, well, we included these pictures because much like in Healdsburg, life was sort of a balance between schoolwork, manual labor that you did to support the school and to support yourself. Every student had 2 hours of, quote, free labor that they would do every day, and that's something that they would just do for the educational purpose of it. And once you worked beyond those 2 hours, then you would get paid, and it was around 10 or 15 cents an hour, so they're really rolling in it. So the picture there at the top middle, you can see a young man who is harvesting hay. His name is Lloyd Martin, and this was the first hay harvest at PUC in Angwin. And on the back of that postcard, that's where the little tidbit is written about how he had to mow that for 2 hours before he'd even get a dime. So we can also see some of these folks are out hoeing in their suit jackets, and also the tractor got stuck in the mud in the crater in front of campus. You can see those buildings are campus buildings. So as you leave the church today and you're looking across that beautiful meadow, it's the same place where students were getting bogged down in 1915. So the picnics, though, they were having picnics from the beginning. So it wasn't all work, was it?
Yeah, I guess not.
A lot of it was work, though, because they only had this summer hotel. They only had some summer cottages. So what were some of the very first tasks you were set to as a student? Well, even beginning in 1910, so almost immediately, once the rainy season ended, they started building the campus that we would know today, doing construction work. And where were they getting all of the materials for that? Well, it was right here.
And they had a great deal of confidence that they could go on indefinitely heating the campus with wood. Really within 20 years or so, it was clear they were overdoing it. The forest was shrinking.
Yeah, but for the first 20 years, they built, the very first building was Groff Hall, and they were also working on Irwin almost immediately. And they were cutting down redwood trees. You can see here the steam tractor. Her name was Old Maud. And they also
Are you sure you didn't go to school here? No.
I've been reading a lot of letters people wrote to Walter Utt. And there were 2 oxen, and I can't remember their names right now. I think one of them was named Gus. But there were 2 oxen that had names as well, and a sawmill on campus just up the hill from where campus is. And one of the artifacts we have here is from this era. We have some steps that you can see. They are very beautifully constructed. You would probably never guess that they were built in the 19-teens. They are steps from the balcony in the Irwin Hall Chapel. Many of you have probably stepped on them. But when you flip them over, you can see bark from the redwood trees they were built from, because they were milled on campus, and from our trees, that's what we were building buildings out of. And it was Professor Newton who was overseeing all this student labor and keeping them on track, and he built steps that have lasted 100 years.
And they were moving very quickly to saw up this lumber and actually use green lumber in some of our buildings.
For whatever happens, happens. Yes. So this is to show you that they were using the hotel as the ladies' dormitory until Groff was finished. Everyone was able to move in by 1913. And illustrious people who stayed in Groff Hall included Ellen White. So here's a little quote that we had about the life in the hotel when you were a girl living there. So I'll read it since the girl said this. All right. PUC was a small family when I first arrived on the hilltop in the fall of 1910 and was given a room in the girls' dormitory, which was the Angwin Hotel building. Hattie Andre, in her pleasant way, soon made us all feel at home, and we fell into dormitory life and enjoyed it. We were soon introduced to the culinary department, where Grandma Irwin had charge, and do we remember the delicious baked pears and brown Betty served very frequently. We enjoyed those home-cooked meals with the tables decorated with the beautiful wild pansies in the center. And she goes on to say that they would pick those pansies in the 1,000 acres, which is what they called the forest.
Yeah, we're trying to revive that name. In recent years, students have referred to our magnificent forest as the Back 40. Aww. But the original name is the 1,000 Acres. That has a little more grandeur to it, I guess.
But I would be curious to know every name people have called it over the years. I'm sure it's gone by a lot of names. So I'm trying to remember, Eric, where would Ellen White stay?
I thought it was a room there on the right-hand side, the second floor.
It was the second floor, south corner.
Yeah.
She liked the sunlight. And that's the building that still is Groff Hall, but it was expanded almost immediately. Ellen White came to visit. Professor Newton reports this in a speech he gave in 1948. He said he remembers he was doing framing and working with some students, and Ellen White came by in her buggy, and she saw them working on Groff Hall, and he said to her, "Well, Mrs. White, what do you think?" And she said, "You need to build it bigger." And almost immediately they had to build an addition.
This is the building of Irwin Hall. You can see the promontory there where they filled with dirt and extended the the footprint of where that building is. Now, of course, it is to the dismay of all old alumni. It is a empty, grassy spot with the back of the building still there, but the front part, the chapel, of course, was removed in 1982.
But
Many of us have this fond hope that someday it can be rebuilt.
And we have many beautiful artifacts from Irwin Hall, not just these stairs, which were given to us by a member of the illustrious PUC alumni. We also have the tin ceiling, which many of you may remember seeing the beauty of it. And there's a story behind that tin ceiling that just kind of goes back to that pioneer spirit of 1909 and after. Professor Newton, again, a man of many talents, he reported that when they purchased the tin for the ceiling, it wasn't painted. And so they really wanted this room to be beautiful. They wanted to finish the tin. And the purveyor tried to convince him. He said, "Oh, I've got a man who will paint it for you. You need to hire this man. He only charges $15 an hour to paint." You remember students were making 15 cents. And Professor Newton was like, "Oh, no." And so he got a bunch of students together, and he had them paint it, and he said they went through and they even double painted it. He petitioned President Irwin for enough money to pay for double paint, and when he gave his speech in 1948, he was in the chapel, and this was, over 50 years after these students had painted, and he pointed at the ceiling, and he said, "Look at it, it still looks great. This is what we are able to accomplish. We don't need to hire someone. Our students did this."
$15 an hour, my goodness.
$15 an hour. But it is very beautiful, and students did it, so we didn't need that man after all.
Well, you can see we have fun spending time in PUC's attics and finding things. This is a picture, of course, of that chapel and the hand-painted ceilings you can see there.
And what's cut off is a quote from President Irwin's mother. She said that the house of the Lord might have something beautiful. So she purchased the oak paneling that surrounded the organ when they built the building.
Now, these are all things that happened very soon after 1909. We're focusing on that anniversary time. This is students again on the steps of the hotel in 1913.
And in this one, you can see Charles at.
Yeah, that's true. Back in the back row.
He was there for
somewhere.
the picture this time. Yeah. Okay.
What other pictures do we have? Oh, yes.
Yeah,
Okay, that's
we
pretty
just have
close to the
campus.
beginning.
Yeah. So in this picture, if you wanted to orient yourself, you can see Irwin Hall is the big building that's the highest with the peaked roof. You can see the hotel on the left, and you can see Groff on the right. And then you can see a farm where the market is, and the church, and the road. And that's what's left.
The thing that we always point out is left from the early days, that wall and that gate, and there's a historical marker on
I
that
wonder,
now.
Eric, if this is a good time for me to ask the question, so what?
We do have to ask that so what question every so often. We're having fun finding things. For example, this. I think a few people in this audience know what this is. I see here someone has carved L. Downing on it. This is the gavel that was given to the presidents of Men of Granger. And we found this hidden away in some storage room, and we were a little mystified why there was a pink cast to this. Turns out that the women of Winning stole it and painted it pink. Now that's fun. That's interesting to think about. Those are those kind of stories you tell on Alumni Weekend. But so what? Does this make a difference? Is this somehow tied to what we're doing here? And you know, all the things we've looked at. Saving a chair from the first building that was the center of campus. Why are we doing that? What is it we're hoping to accomplish? I think I would answer that question by asking another question. And that's supposed to be a Jewish thing, I think, or a psychiatric thing.
It is the Sabbath.
But my dad was a psychiatrist, so I'll ask another question. What if we fail? We know schools around the country that have failed. Schools that start out with one mission and end up with another and eventually close up. I don't think we're going to fail, but what if we fail? What would happen to this campus if we failed? I think it would be turned into a resort. It would be like what we started out with in 1909. Now, these artifacts, these relics, these things we find are tied to that question, what if we fail? Because I think we succeed when we remember our past, when we remember why we're here, what our mission is, when we think about the place, the water, the resources, the educational vision. When we think about those things, when we're reminded of those, we can be confident that the school will continue, that it will be successful, that it has a mission until the Lord comes. Now, what I think I'm saying here is the success of PUC, to a large degree, is in your hands. As graduates of PUC, you need to remind all of us who work here, what is the mission? Are you faithful to that mission? Have you continued to maintain that educational vision that started the school? And I think the answer is very clear, especially as you look at what our administration has been doing lately, recognizing the value of the land, the importance of the land in education, and that's just one part of the story.
And in holistic living, circling back and telling this story to our newest generation of PUC students, who then get to see where they fit in this long history, this series of stories that create the message that we're still trying to live out, that it goes from the beginning to now, and that they can tie themselves to those founders, those
so
pioneers.
So they're seeing that when you present that.
Well, that's what I'm trying, and they do a great job of listening, and I think some of them are inspired. I think it's really nice to find where you fit, and one of the things that they've really enjoyed is tying themselves not just to a greater history of PUC, but to a greater history of the Adventist Church. They can see that founders of the church were also founders of this school, and that they had their fingerprints on the doorknobs of Groff Hall, that Ellen White lived nearby, that she cared about PUC students, that you're not only a part of Adventist education in practice, you're part of a history and a story of Adventist education too.
Two more artifacts before we're out of time. This pulpit goes back to 1913. That's pretty close to the beginning. And we say various things about it. We know that it was in the chapel in the hotel. We know that quite possibly Ellen White spoke at this, although she wasn't very active in 1913. But I'll tell you the most interesting thing to me, the thing that really says something about PUC and our tradition, this pulpit was built by students. This is a class project. Now, one more thing, and maybe this is more significant than some of the things we found. Katie, you have a story to tell about a discovery. As you were working through the somewhat disorganized papers left to you, you found something kind of interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a very old school, so I give a caveat first. It's a very old school with a lot of history to have kept. And we've kind of, collected sort of haphazardly. When it was the pioneer era, there wasn't, an archivist was not the top of the list when you need a dormitory, right? So we kept things, and then in the 1980s, Gary Shearer came here, and he started to gather those things that had been saved. Then Gilbert Abela was the archivist, sort of librarian, and he began to sort them into piles. And then now I get to be here, and I get to go through the piles and find cool stuff. So you may have heard that we found a page from a letter written by Ellen White. And what we know about that letter is that I found the page in kind of a map case, big flat files, because the page is an unusual size. It wouldn't fit in a regular filing cabinet. So at some point in the past, Gary Shearer did see this letter. I know he did because his wife wrote me an email and said, that sounds familiar. We tried to find out if it was truly written by Ellen White, but it was 1983. And so what happened was they couldn't make a perfect facsimile and send it to the White Estate in 1983 and have the experts there identify her handwriting. And the page that we had did not have her signature because it was an incomplete letter at that time. That's all we had. And so Gary Shearer didn't know if it was Ellen White. We didn't know if it was Ellen White. But at the beginning of this school year, we were able to make a really beautiful scan of it and send it to a lot of people who would know her hand very well. And they said, yes, this is an incomplete letter by Ellen White, and it is one we've never seen before. Congratulations, PUC. Do you have the rest of it? And we said, maybe. And so we were looking everywhere. Every time we would open a box or a drawer, we would be looking to see if we did have the rest of this letter, or if it was just, lost, because the letter was written in 1882. It's exactly as old as the school. We didn't know. But then, about a week and a half ago, I found it. So we're really excited.
This is the second page.
Yeah. So, yeah.
And we have some pictures of this letter, don't we?
We do.
This,
There's
it's
the
always
complete
dangerous
thing.
to interpret half of a letter.
Yep.
Just to
Do you want your...
maybe simplify a little bit, if you read the letter that Elder Corliss wrote to Mrs. White, it really is a letter that says, I'm worried about some of my colleagues who are kind of lax. And my colleagues aren't living up to the light we've been given. And some of the other ministers really aren't supportive of the spirit of prophecy. And I thought, okay, that's what that letter is. If you read the whole letter, and this is fairly typical of Ellen White, people who tried to use her and try to make her into a weapon to support whatever their cause was, found that she was difficult to control. So she agrees with Brother Corliss that, yes, indeed, there are some people who are not appreciating fully the prophetic ministry that she has. But in the middle of the letter, and I think we have this one, she says something to Corliss. And this is, you can see the handwriting. I'm not sure if some of you have a problem reading it. Many people here grew up reading cursive writing. After the first word, Brother Corliss, I entreat you to walk humbly, be willing to be servant of all, be patient, pure and simple as a child, meek, pure, and simple as a child. Ellen White apparently didn't believe in commas that much. Putting everything like pomposity and self-esteem, or putting away anything like pomposity or self-exaltation.
Yeah.
So he's telling her, we got some people who aren't as fervent as they should be. And she's saying, yeah, that's important, but you need to be a servant. You need to avoid exalting yourself. And I don't know how he took that letter. It was a letter that agreed, but then said, yes, but. And added this kind of counsel to him that may have been a surprise. I don't know. Well, that's what we've been talking about around campus. We're excited to have this letter, to find the whole letter, and we think it's an indication of the sort of thing that will happen as we're careful to preserve our history. We keep finding other things. We know that many of you, and this is the altar call, I guess, many of you have historical materials that need to be saved. A year or so ago, we made a presentation on what we were finding on the PUC campus, and Pastor Mark Wittes came forward and said, some members of my family were involved in an Adventist offshoot led by Margaret Rowan. And he brought the file in, and it's all kinds of really important stuff, including a marvelous, shocking, fake Ellen White letter that Margaret Rowan tried to slip into the files so she would be identified as Ellen White's successor. That's quite a story in itself. She failed. And she ended up well, she wanted to kill one of her supporters and going to prison and so on. But that's an interesting story in itself, needs to be preserved. So we think you have letters, we think you have documents, you have artifacts that are part of that story. And the point of saving the past is you only save the past if you're a going concern, if you're still living by those principles. And I assure you today, PUC is a going concern. We need to save our past. We need to recognize the things that made us what we are today. Now,
So that's our altar call. And we've included, if you put it up on the screen, a couple questions that Walter Utt asked those first alumni in a survey he sent out before he wrote the first edition of the college history. These are questions that we still want to know the answers, but we need the answers from you. So
college history needs to be updated.
Yeah, it needs an update. So we're just putting the questions out there. We know that you think about this, especially when you come back to Alumni Weekend. These are things that are coming to your mind. You're having memories that we want to hear them, and we want to know your story, and we want to preserve your history, because even though we didn't go here, Eric, it's our history too.
Are you sure? Maybe.
So thank you very much, and happy Sabbath.
I invite the congregation to stand for the benediction. Father in heaven, as we mark 110 years in this place, we pause to recognize that you are the founder of this school, to recognize that you planted us here. We thank you for all the changes over the last 110 years, the buildings, the classrooms, the lives changed. And we pray that as we wait the second coming, this may be a place known for streams of living water. In the name of Jesus.